Hey all, I'm Sarah Siefkin, and today I'll spend a few minutes talking about an imperiled minnow species called the virgin spinedace in the Santa Clara River of southwestern Utah. I'll start by introducing you to the virgin spinedace, then give a quick overview of the river basin. I'll spend a little bit of time discussing threats to the species, and then review some of the conservation projects that have already taken place, talk about what worked, what didn't work, and finally, I'll wrap things up with my recommendations for future projects to help protect this fish. To start out, I'll introduce you to the virgin spinedace, Lepidomata mollispinus. This fish is a silvery streamlined minnow that averages 7 to 13 centimeters in length. Spinedace kind of remind me of miniature trout. They aren't super closely related, but they have a similar body shape and behaviors. So, for example, you can see in this photo, their bodies are laterally compressed and they have large upturned mouths. Their preferred habitats are little plunge pools with overhanging veg or rocks for cover. And Spinedace reproduce in the spring. There's evidence that high flows during spring runoff are a good biological trigger for spawning. And of course, as their common names suggest, virgin Spinedace are endemic to the Virgin River Basin, which includes its main tributary, the Santa Clara River. So, to set the stage, this is the Santa Clara River. Its headwaters begin above treeline in the Pine Valley Mountains at around 10,000 feet. And as the river loses elevation, it's occasionally impounded by dams, including Gunlock Reservoir there. Below Gunlock, the Santa Clara flows through a classic Mojave Desert landscape that only gets about 7 inches of precipitation annually. And through these middle reaches, the river is running through small towns, agricultural land, and the Shivwits Band of Southern Paiute Reservation. The Santa Clara runs through urban areas around the city of St. George until it finally reaches its confluence with the Virgin River. Before the southwestern U.S. was colonized by white settlers, virgin spine were found throughout the relatively cool reaches of the main stem Virgin River and most of its tributaries. Unfortunately, their populations began to decline, mostly due to habitat loss, and by 1994, the fish was restricted to just about 60% of its historically occupied range, which you can see on the map there. As a result of these dwindling populations, the virgin spinedace was petitioned for listing as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, first in 1994 and again in 2012. And along those same lines, the IUCN Red List categorized the species as vulnerable. Virgin spinedace populations in the Santa Clara River exemplified these basin-wide trends. Here, their historically occupied range extended into the higher elevation tributaries all the way down to the Virgin River confluence. But again, by the time the fish was petitioned for listing in the 90s, its distribution had shrunk significantly. Things weren't too bad in the upstream tribs, but as you can see here, Spinedace were nearly extirpated from the 38-kilometer reach of the Santa Clara between Gunluck Reservoir and the Virgin River confluence. So what's going on here? Why are virgin Spinedace populations dwindling in the Santa Clara River? These are a few of the reasons, but I thought, instead of going over each one of these threats really quickly, I'd like to focus just on the first few. And three of these are directly related to water. So the first three threats I'll discuss harm virgin spinedace by degrading their habitat, specifically the environmental flows in the Santa Clara River. And the term environmental flows refers to the quantity, quality, and timing of in-stream flows required to support a healthy river ecosystem. And at the risk of stating the obvious, fish need water, but virgin spinedace live in a desert. So you can imagine anything that alters environmental flows is really going to hurt Spinedace. One of the most obvious consequences of degraded environmental flows is that the river can dry intermittently during hot summer months. And obviously, drying is bad. It limits habitat connectivity and can trap fish in isolated pools. But even if there isn't outright drying, low stream flow can be a problem. It causes water temperatures to increase, which lowers dissolved oxygen levels, and it can also concentrate pollutants. Um, and it's not just the quantity of in-stream water that matters. Timing is important too. So, like I mentioned earlier, spring runoff can trigger spawning, but years with bad spring runoff, like this year, are closely tied to poor fish reproduction. And you also lose that nice habitat heterogeneity that's created by big scouring floods. So, with all that in mind, let's look at a few of the threats to virgin Spinedace that degrade environmental flows in the Santa Clara River. Anthropogenic climate change is a big one, and it's almost certainly already harmed virgin Spinedace populations in the Santa Clara River. Here in the desert Southwest, the most noticeable effects of climate change are increasing air temperature and decreasing precipitation. And these two changes have clear implications for the environmental flows in the Santa Clara River. Um, what does this actually look like? So, for example, we're in the middle of a 20-year drought, which shows no signs of abating. And if you've seen recent photos in the news of the record low reservoir levels at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, you have a pretty good idea of the conditions in southwestern Utah. It's pretty dry out there. Rapid human population growth, coupled with unsustainable water use, also alter environmental flows and hurt Spinedace in the Santa Clara River. The population of St. George, Utah, and its adjacent suburbs increased by nearly 30% between 2010 and 2020, which is the fifth fastest growth rate for a metropolitan area in the US. And most of the county's drinking and irrigation water comes from the Virgin River and its tributaries, including the Santa Clara, which means there are more people that are competing with river ecosystems for increasingly scarce water resources. Also, Washington County residents use a lot of water. It's an average of 302 gallons per capita daily, which is more than twice the national average. And you can see on this graph, a lot higher than other cities in the region with similar climate. So Vegas, LA, Phoenix. These high water use rates are likely caused by a combination of economics and policy. So, for example, both culinary and secondary water are really cheap in St. George, and just basic market principles are going to dictate that there's very little economic incentive for people to conserve water when it's so cheap. The final threat I want to discuss here isn't directly related to water, but it definitely has a massive impact on virgin Spinedace conservation, and that's the politics and culture of southwestern Utah. There's this Old West constituency that identifies with these ideas of rugged individualism or like resource extraction. And I'd say many of these folks kind of resent natural resource law for what they see as burdensome federal overreach and infringement on private property rights. And obviously, while these attitudes aren't unique to southern Utah, we've had a few recent incidents that gained national attention. And one of them was that armed conflict in Bunkerville, which is just a 45-minute drive across the Nevada border. And that standoff, if it rings a bell, was directly related to the ESA listing of the Mojave Desert tortoise and its critical habitat on a BLM grazing allotment that was leased by the Bundys. Clearly, that's a particularly bad example, but it really points towards a regional political culture that's deeply skeptical of federal regulations, especially the ESA. So, what has been done about this? While threats from climate change, human population growth, unsustainable water use, and that political resistance to government regulation are still issues here, important steps have been taken to protect the virgin spine days. First of all, they needed a plan, right? And as I mentioned earlier, the Virgin Spinedace was petitioned for federal listing as threatened under the ESA in 1994. And the 90s were a tense time for conservation. There had been a few ESA listings that had gotten pretty contentious, like the northern spotted owl up there in the Pacific Northwest. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the conservation community was pretty apprehensive about this. On one hand, this fish was clearly in trouble, but on the other hand, they had just watched other ESA listings degrade into animosity and violence. So instead of going for that top-down ESA listing, they opted for a more cooperative local approach. A wide range of stakeholders from the public and private sector at the local, state, tribal, and federal level all got together and wrote the Virgin Spine Days Conservation Agreement and Strategy, which I'll just call the VSAS. Um, and conservation agreements aren't perfect, obviously. They don't carry nearly as much legal weight as a full ESA listing, but they do have some benefits. At least in southwestern Utah, that Old West constituency I mentioned seems more motivated by locally led conservation efforts, especially if the main goal is to prevent ESA listing. So, with all that in mind, the VSAS was written. They identified goals and objectives to recover spine days throughout the Virgin River Basin. And one of the top goals was to return locally extirpated spine days to the lower Santa Clara River. If we're going to return spine days to the lower Santa Clara River, we're going to need more water for those environmental flows. And that's a lot easier said than done. Uh, I'm sure you know Western water rights are notoriously litigious and complicated. And it's not like there's a lot of extra water in the Virgin River Basin. By 1903, all the water rights had already been claimed. So if there's no extra water flowing around, how do we find extra water to put in the river as in-stream? The answer is complicated, expensive, and kind of messy, but it worked. As I mentioned earlier, portions of the Santa Clara flow through the Shivwits Paiute Reservation, and in 2000, a Water Rights Settlement Act returned 4,000 acre-feet each year of federally reserved water rights to the Shivwits Paiute. And again, there's not extra water flowing around, so open irrigation ditches near the Santa Clara were piped, and that reduced the amount of water lost through seepage and evaporation. So it essentially freed up more water. This water was returned to the Shivwits Paiute, and then the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources every year leases over 1,800 acre-feet from the Shivwits Paiute to release into the Santa Clara River for those environmental flows. And by and large, for a while, that did the trick. Virgin spine days were translocated to the lower Santa Clara in 2010, and monitoring the following year showed that the fish had reproduced and that there were nice self-sustaining populations there. While restoring environmental flows and virgin spine days populations to the lower Santa Clara was a major accomplishment, it wasn't a silver bullet. So that new water lease restored in-stream flows for a few years, but in 2015 we started noticing intermittent drying in the summer. And of course, spine days numbers are just tanking in response. So you can see in this graph here, these are data from 2 annual monitoring stations, and you can see how estimated population densities are just declining as stream flow declines. So, what are the next steps for virgin Spinedace conservation in the Santa Clara River? I think it's important to recognize the successful projects that were directed by the VSAS. So, getting those water rights for in-stream flows was a big deal, but at the same time, it isn't realistic to expect the same conservation actions to work indefinitely. And I think a good place to start would be to address those threats I discussed earlier. So climate change, human population growth, unsustainable water use, and the political culture of southern Utah. I have a couple quick examples. The first one touches on both climate change and the political culture of southern Utah. Um, Down here, a lot of stakeholders will just shut down when they hear the phrase climate change. But it is a huge part of virgin spine-based conservation. So instead, for now, let's just talk about the drought. Everyone here, no matter their political persuasions, loves talking about the drought. And it's not perfect, but I think that's just a simple way to keep those lines of communication open. Also, Washington County could implement some really basic water conservation policies. We use so much water down here that simple changes that other cities have been using for decades already could have a huge impact. So, for example, I'm thinking setting up a tiered water pricing structure or offering rebates to encourage people to replace their turf with xeriscaping. And these are just basic things that can help save water and conserve spine days. Um, and yeah, ultimately, if those locally led conservation efforts guided by the VSAS aren't effective, then federal listing under the Endangered Species Act might be the best option to protect these fish. To wrap things up, the threats to virgin spine dace in the lower Santa Clara River are serious, but they aren't insurmountable. And conservation strategies used here could ultimately help protect imperiled fish throughout the desert Southwest. So I'll finish with this quote. There are no hopeless cases, only people without hope and expensive cases. Thanks for your time.